All right, we are back to the air we breathe, and we are on chapter 4, and it's entitled Consent. That is something of a loaded word these days. The quote coming from Rachel Den Hollander from 2018, "How much is this little girl worth?" was such a sharp, heavy, hard comment for just a few words. One that just kind of hits you deep in the guts. In the context, obviously, this is talking about the extremely extensive, long-standing abuse issues in the USA Gymnastics. It was their actual team doctor who was molesting and abusing athletes, girls who were sent to him for evaluation, for care, for treatment by the USA Olympic Committee. And this apparently happened for years and years and years, hundreds of girls.
And they never reported him?
So I don't know. I don't recall a lot of the facts of the case. The crazy thing is, and this was followed up by some of the statistics that he offered about the UK about this very small percentage of, I think it was rapes maybe, that are reported.
Yeah.
And that of those, how many are pursued? Of those, how many are convictions? I mean, the number gets smaller each time. The worst, and this is potentially the worst scandal in American sports history. But if there is a competitor, it happened not that long before that, 2018, or I mean, the trial was 2018. So this is almost happening somewhat simultaneously. Was the years, if not decades, of abuse in the Penn State football program. Penn State football, which was considered for decades to be one of the pinnacle programs of the sport. And the head coach was there for decades. He was an institution within the sport, Joe Paterno. And his very long-time defensive coordinator was molesting boys in the locker room. Not football players, but in like camps that the team would hold. That's very common for these universities to hold various training camps. And you bring in recruits, but you also bring in youth players because you want to build pipelines and make connections for recruiting one day. You work with local coaches. And so there was always an opportunity, especially over summers, for youth football players to be around the university. And this man was abusing and molesting. So, I think some of these boys were like 8, 9 years old, maybe. And it was happening for decades. I think it was 20 years or something. And there was an active cover-up, and that there was open talk when this all came out. The head coach was forced into retirement, died not that long after all this came out. But there was some talk like we might have to just end this program. And this is one of the this is like, even if you don't follow college football, this is one of the, this is Notre Dame, this is Ohio State, this is Michigan, this is US. These are two like, oh, I remember them from years ago kind of stuff. So the penalties that were assessed, they did not close the program, but the penalties were very significant. It's come back over the years, but there was almost a sense of, we don't know what to do with this. We don't know what to do with a crime so terrible. And the governing body of the sport, the NCAA, was actually, they were in a lot of hot water themselves because they were saying, look, we these are not NCAA violations. We have no rules to deal with something like this. We deal with cheating. We deal with recruiting violations. We deal with people misbehaving on the field or in the class. Like, we have no laws that even conceived this was possible. These are criminal offenses happening outside of our jurisdiction. So we don't know what to do with it. So, I mean, they imposed a bunch of penalties, but there was a lot of like, how do you deal with this? Now, what was never even on the radar was this was not worth dealing with. Whether we're talking about the scandal with USA Gymnastics or the scandal at Penn State, there is zero doubt of anyone in the nation that this was a problem, that this was wrong. This was a crime. Where is the person who said, no, they should have done that? You know, that person doesn't exist. That's what's so maybe shocking about this chapter, is the reminder of the culture in which the gospel is, the seeds are sown, was a culture which would have said, this is not a crime. As a matter of fact, this is perfectly understandable. If not, I did that myself. That's, you know, as you're reading this chapter, and this is a hard chapter. This is a hard chapter because a lot of these chapters are very deep and provocative. This one was ugly and sad and disturbing. But being disturbed by being reminded of what the gospel has transformed so fully and completely that it is inconceivable for us to understand the opposite position. That's how fully the gospel has transformed, like, humanity's way of thinking. The stuff that we just talked about, a doctor molesting girls, a high-profile coach molesting little boys. Those were not crimes. That was Thursday. Like, that's what you do. That's what you did. There's a whole description. There's a word in Latin to describe basically the boy that you use for pleasure before you get married, or sometimes even after you are married. Like, there's names for all this stuff. And the idea that, you know, the girl especially, but the woman being, you know, male property, you know, especially if we're talking about someone who is not a Roman citizen or a slave. I mean, and it wasn't even like a look down upon thing. Like, it was so fully accepted. I hate making a bad situation. Like, this seems unnecessary to talk about because it's awful enough as it is. We don't need to pretend that in American slavery of the 17 and 1800s, that there weren't slave owners who took advantage of their slaves and even had children by them. That was not probably particularly uncommon. However, even then, it was considered kind of shameful. Maybe a wink and a nudge and a nod, like, yeah, we all know. But it was not anything like, hey, guess what I did, everybody? That it was sort of seen as like indulging in something you shouldn't, but we all know that people do. You follow what I mean? Mm-hmm. But in the Roman ancient culture, it wasn't shameful. It was fully expected.
You had a wife and then you had
it's just what you did. Yeah. There was no reason to even hide it. You know, the brothels that lined the streets, and him saying that, well, you can just have a slave woman for the price of a loaf of bread. I mean, they're written about. As a matter of fact, when they're written about negatively, they were written about negatively in a sense of you showed your kind of your stoic strength of will by not doing what everyone was doing. Not because it was horrifically wrong, but this is almost like a way to show off. Like, I am so in control of myself, I don't do these things. Not that the things are wrong or bad or shameful or perverse, none of that. It was just, look how masterful I am of myself. Again, it's just, it is nigh inconceivable for us. So I was not going to talk about what I'm going to bring up right now. I told you guys some of my circuitous adventures this morning. So I was in the car a fair amount before I got here. This is no hyperbole. I was listening to this unexpectedly on a podcast almost right before I got to church to set this up. It was about a man who was raised in an Arabic Muslim predominant culture. He himself is Arabic. He no longer identifies as Muslim. I think he might be an atheist, but I didn't get that far into it to find out, because just the story that he was starting with, it struck me so painfully. And it was this chapter, except it was today. And he said, in the culture, this was not 1,000 years ago. This guy was 45. And he said, when I was 5 years old, I was raped, but I never told anyone, because in my culture, they kill the rapist. In my culture, they kill the one who was raped, because it was so shameful. A father would rather murder his daughter than than live with this perpetual shame of what had been done to her. As a boy, he was so terrified because he had seen it happen to women that he never brought it up and dealt with this on his own for years, and only as an adult became open with it. And this was instrumental in him leaving Islam and certainly his culture. And he's dealing with the repercussions even now. Like, there are people who are basically out to get him because of these accusations that you're making and the way that you are impugning our culture and our faith and everything else. And again, I didn't know this was true. Like, I didn't not only this one story, like, I didn't know that today there were nations that, like, people lived in where it was better to kill your son or daughter if they had been raped than allow them to live, because of the shame that you would feel, the shame it brings about on your family or whatever. Just how, again, this is incomprehensible to me. But it is incomprehensible because I have stopped paying attention to the change the gospel has made on my life and in the world. Again, we've had a few chapters now where we've talked about looking at nature. You look at nature and you say, the dog eat dog world, or the survival of the fittest, or the might makes right, and we see this in the animal world. It takes very little to see that, the taking of pleasure from another animal or the assertion of dominance happens all the time. We've seen dogs, and it's sort of the immature laughter that I can hear from my own kids when one of the dogs will hump another dog or whatever. And like, for dogs, it's very instinctual, and dogs in particular, there's this dominance hierarchy. And they're communicating, it's not a one-to-one correlation like we might think, but there's like this instinctual, natural sense of establishing a dominant hierarchy, and that's one way that it's done. They're not taught this behavior, it just kind of happens. So we can again take example from the natural world to see that, you know, this taking is, whether it's a power or dominance or pleasure or whatever it is, and that the gospel has changed that. But just the depth of how awful that the story that I heard right before I got here, I don't see that in the natural world. Like, that's even worse. It's bad enough to think that just because I'm bigger or stronger or faster, or whatever, I can take a body if I felt like it. Whether I want to feel good or whether I want to feel powerful or whether I want to denigrate you or to mark you as nothing. But if I'm strong enough or if I'm rich enough, I can just do what I want. But then the sense of like the because animals don't feel shame. Now we're going to compound this with an honor shame culture that says, well, now that you are used goods, you're so shameful to have around. I, as your husband, I, as your brother, I'm just going to kill you because it's better that you don't exist. So this is how the culture that we're reading about in the abstract, and like, oh my gosh, how could they think such a way? And it still exists somehow. It still exists. I don't get it. I really don't. But again, this is the luxury we have. This is the blessing, the grace of having a culture so infused, so steeped in the gospel, people don't even realize how it has fundamentally changed how we see the world. And this concept of consent, this concept of might does not make right. And you being violated does not eliminate your worth. And I'm looking at this quote, how much is a little girl worth? And that was only talking about the penalty and the punishment due to the offender. And I never thought for a moment, like my mind's percolating about what we're going to talk about. And then literal minutes before I get here, I'm hearing the story and it's taking it in a dimension I'm not prepared for. How much is that little girl worth? Because apparently now her value, once violated by the doctor, is zero. Not just to punish the doctor. The doctor's going to get punished anyway, but now let's punish her too. And that's a horror that only humanity can bring to the table. Because once again, animals don't feel shame. If something bad happens to an animal, they just kind of keep on going. The other animals don't punish them for that. There might be a consequence because, like, if you are injured, you might not have long to live because there's just no mercy or pity. But there's no shame. There's no retribution. So, this is not just humans as animals. This is humans with our own ability to think and to feel and with agency and with sentience and with everything else, and actually choosing purposefully to make things even more horrible. So this is what is possible outside of the scope of the gospel. A culture without mercy, a culture without pity, a culture without compassion, a culture where not only does might make right, but your weakness could actually become your destruction by those who you are closest to.
ask you this.
Yeah.
How do people overcome this? What's the process for overcoming this? I mean, not everybody has that problem, but it's a problem that exists in our culture. Is there anything standing up to that, saying, don't do that?
Standing up to what? Just so I understand.
Standing up to a man taking his pleasure wherever he feels like it.
Well, the law, first of all. This is a big digression, and I'm gonna get myself into trouble here. I really dislike this, and if you've never heard of this, then I don't intend to muddy the waters here. But for many years now, 10, 15, 20 years, there has been a critique from certain circles, but it's been about our nation, about having a rape culture. And I think that those accusations are false. But basically, like, oh, women are so vulnerable, and the Good Old Boy Network, and men protect men, and what men really need to do, if we wanted to stop rape, men could stop rape at any time, but we don't, because we indulge it because of the power, or because of what, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, what is described in the beginning of this chapter is in the beginning of the chapter because the guy was on trial and was convicted, and this was the sentencing phase. Rape is illegal. It is illegal. And we can talk about, well, you know, so-and-so knew and he didn't tell anybody, or the sheriff didn't believe me, or the prosecuting attorney said there's not enough evidence. And we can talk about what are the options that might make this better or easier or more just or whatever. But ultimately, I think we have a culture that has already spoken quite clearly, rape is wrong, it's illegal. As a matter of fact, it is potentially a capital offense. There's only two others. What are all the and this is in any jurisdiction within America, off the top of my head, I can only think of 3 capital offenses. There are only 3 crimes that you would potentially forfeit your life. And many jurisdictions say there's 0. Oops, that was my camera. That's all right. I'm still on camera. Don't worry about it. Number 1 is murder. Number 2 is rape. Number 3 is treason, but that's actually a federal crime. But so I'm saying, like, of all the things that can be done, this is one of only 2 real crimes / 3 that has given, you know, the ultimate consequence to. Whether or not it's easy or difficult to prove or to convict, I am more than willing for us to have that as a, you know, that's the sort of cultural conversation that is worth having periodically, because, you know, you want this to work. You want this to be a true deterrent. You want it to be a true consequence. Frankly, you want rape eliminated completely. I don't know if that's ever going to happen, in the same way that what crime is ever eliminated completely? We're dealing with the broken wickedness of humanity. You know, they've outlawed guns in the United Kingdom for many years. So they attack each other with knives and they throw acid. It's crazy. You took away the tool, but you have not changed human nature. But I will say, I find an essential qualitative difference in a culture that, however imperfectly prosecutes rape, to one that says this is not a crime. What I don't understand are, like, the culture that I mentioned from this podcast, or anything that approaches, like, we're kind of resurrecting this ancient perspective in this particularly heinous way. Anything that looks like that today, why? Like, how?
The news every night just about celebrities raping children, or
So,
constant.
you know, when was Me Too? Like 2016? There was a very needed corrective in certain segments where sometimes it was out and out rape, sometimes it was sexual harassment, sometimes it was, you know, somewhere in that spectrum of started with women coming out and saying, me too, this happened to me. A powerful man thought he could get away with it, and for many years he did, but now I'm going to, if we all stand up together, then this can't get swept under the rug anymore. And for stuff that got swept under the rug, unsweep it, man. I am with you. Unsweep that nonsense, because that's wicked and that's awful, and it's a crime. So don't let the powerful or the rich or the strong get away with crimes. It began to spread. And there were men who would stand up as well. This happened to me too. And this is not to try to, push things in any particular direction, but the abuse of males or the rape of males is a smaller percentage, but it comes with a stigma that is different. This is really weird. What a coincidental week I've had about this. I was watching a different podcast, because this is a couple of days ago, about an actor. I don't know if I said the name, if he would mean anything to you at all. Terry Crews. He was a former football player turned actor, and he has a super interesting life. Very, very, very hard things that he overcame. But he's like 6'5", he's 250 pounds, and he's basically known for being incredibly chiseled, muscular, but he's got this really nice sense of humor. He's been on several TV shows, been in several movies. He was the dad in Everybody Hates Chris. He was a detective in Brooklyn Nine-Nine. He has played in a variety of movies that call for an incongruously funny, giant, muscular guy, because we don't kind of put those two things together. And he came out maybe in 2018 or something like that, saying, this happened to me. I was groped by a powerful Hollywood producer. And he like on a TV interview, and he described this really kind of awful sounding situation. And immediately, other male celebrities chimed in to say, either I don't believe it, because you could have beaten that guy to death, or what kind of wimp are you that you didn't beat that guy to death? And no one would ever conceive of telling a woman that.
No.
I'm not trying to set the two against each other, like one is worse or better than the other. I'm just saying they're different. I think that what I have been told in the sociological and psychological definition of rape is that, we've probably all heard this at this point, but that it's not so much a sexual act as it is an act of power.
Yeah.
It's a violation of power. Well, I can understand in a physical sense why women would feel particularly vulnerable. The flip side of that is, when it does happen to a man, the man, because he shouldn't feel so physically vulnerable, feels responsible in a different way. And it's just a little different. Again, I'm not saying better, I'm not saying worse, I'm not saying whatever moral superior, none of that. I'm just saying that hearing that response, it shouldn't happen to guys either. But then what happens when he does, like the courage of the women to say, look, this happened to me, now we're going to stand together and make sure this stops happening. And if you thought you got away with it, you didn't. And then a man stands up and he's either told to stop, or he's told, well, you weren't much of a man to, I guess, if you let this happen. What about the other? Are other men going to stand up then who it happened to? Now that they've seen what's happened to somebody else, maybe that becomes the same sort of discouragement that women have had to already fight with. It's a terrible thing regardless. But isn't it amazing that we can all be like, this is one of those few universal opinions, except it's not universal. And that's crazy to us, I think. When you read this chapter, did it make any sense to you? I mean, not in the sense of like, I can't comprehend it, but I mean, like, considering a culture like that, it seems so incredibly foreign, like an alien planet kind of foreign. Who in their right mind would say what a good idea this is? But that is the incredible change and transformation that the gospel had on the entire Western world.
Observation, real quick.
Yeah.
The Jews had very strict sexual laws and rules.
Yes.
Now, granted, they were a tiny, tiny minority, but because the gospel grew out of that, was that basically laying God's groundwork for it?
It certainly seems that way, because remember, as we go through the chapter, we are getting a set of mores, sort of morality that also continues to transform the notion of marriage. And we have that section where both Jesus responding in the Gospels, but also referring back to Old Testament regulations about things like divorce. That, well, why was Solomon allowed to have a bunch of concubines? Or why does Moses allow the certificate of divorce? And the explanation is, well, it's because of the hardness of your hearts, or the stiffness of your necks, or because you weren't up for it. Like, this is the best we can do with you guys. That it is of enormous importance for the understanding of the concept that when they asked Jesus about sexual morality, about divorce, about the nature of marriage and all that kind of stuff, he says, in the beginning, this is what happened. He goes back to Genesis. That's where this quotation is. It's talking about Adam and Eve, but the sense is God had a purpose from the beginning. Now that purpose had to be mitigated at some point because we weren't doing it. But that was not its intention from the beginning. So you want to ask me what this is about? He says, this is what it's about. Are you able to keep up with it? I guess not. But so even within the Jewish culture, the seeds are there. The foundation is there. This is the way it ought to be. But even, throughout the Old Testament, we have plenty of examples of how it was not followed through on. And the not following through on seemed to be kind of accepted. So somebody asked me about this the other day, about there's some kind of show on TV about, it was like one of those reality shows, but it was about polygamy. And, well, I thought the polygamy was in the Bible. I'm like, okay, so believe it or not, it's never endorsed in the Old Testament, but it is described. Now, am I like being too cute here and like, trying to fudge with nuance and clever little sidesteps? I mean, maybe, but it's true. It is never endorsed like, this is a great idea, and God says, please keep marrying as many people as possible. But it's recorded that such things happen. There are often examples of when this happens, the problems that it causes. So we can say, well, wait a second, Father Abraham, he's the beginning of the Judaism and the nation of Israel and all this kind of stuff. And he is the receiver of the promise, the covenant with God's people. That's him. And he had 2 wives. He impregnates his slave woman or his servant or whatever, Hagar. Yes. But what does that lead to? Ishmael, who is this, is described through no fault of Ishmael's own. Like Abraham loves Ishmael, and Ishmael is never condemned for who he is. But the strife between those two sides of the family seems to be permanent. And there's even this prophetic word that this is always going to be a problem. And generally speaking, the historical context suggests that the Arab nationalities grow from the line of Ishmael. Even in the Quran, that's who they identify as, we are connected to Abraham, but we are not connected through Isaac, and we are not connected through Jacob and his 12 sons and the 12 tribes of Israel. We are connected to the promise, though, and we are connected to Father Abraham. He's our father too, through Ishmael. Well, we have some historical precedents that the Arabs and the Israelis don't tend to get along. King David had many wives and concubines. How'd that work out for him? Same thing with Solomon. That didn't work out well at all. Maybe here's a patriarch. Here's a patriarch. Judah sleeps with his daughter. She doesn't know, but he's looking for a prostitute, and she has to disguise herself. And it's seen as to Judah's shame. But it still happens. So the morality that Jesus clarifies in the gospel is not being invented on the fly, but it is hearkening back to original intent that has just been not followed through on. I would liken that in some kind of offhanded way to the most famous speech given by Martin Luther King, and it's become one of the most famous speeches in American history. I have a dream. And he says it on the lawn of the U.S. Capitol. This is like in by the reflecting pool and the Washington Memorial, and he explicitly invokes the words of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. And he says his dream is that would actually happen and not just be a promise, but it would be a fulfilled reality. And even the framers of the government, of the Constitution, but even prior to that, Jefferson owned slaves, and he writes the Declaration of Independence. In the when the Declaration of Independence is being debated, there is open debate in the second in the Congress that how can we say some of these words when we've got this whole class of humanity that we're not applying it to. And so there was some talk like, well, we should have no slaves before we say yes to this. And then another class says, no, we can't, we're not going to get rid of our slaves. And these compromises are made because what can we do now versus the future? And there were some people, John Adams being one of them, who said, we're putting this off for later, but we're gonna have to pay the consequences of it at some point, which we certainly did. And to some degree continue to do. We can easily say that, and this was one of Lincoln's kind of principles. Um, we are paying in blood for not fulfilling the promises we made at our inception. 650,000 Americans died in the Civil War. And that is almost a direct consequence of not doing what the original intention was. So having an intention that is not carried through is not that shocking, I guess. But this is sort of what we're dealing with. Like from the beginning, this is the way it's supposed to be. But even the people who should have carried that message did it so poorly that they had to have all these accommodations. They had to have all this mitigation. They had, when Jesus says, well, Moses let you write the certificate of divorce because you guys couldn't handle it otherwise, is not endorsing it. It's simply describing like, well, the best you could do was still pretty crummy. But the intention is this. I preached years ago because the lectionary came up, brought this passage. And so I preached on it. And I tried what I thought was to preach with this very overt sense of grace. That we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That nothing about divorce was uniquely sinful, and to point out ways that we've all broken God's intent for us, and that there were some circumstances where it seemed to be the basically the least bad of all bad options. Sometimes there's the avoiding abuse or avoiding some awful things and some terrible things. There's also just an acknowledgement of our own failings and our own frailties. And I tried my very best to toe a line of not trying to explain away the words of Jesus, but also have them presented in such a manner that no matter who it was listening, even someone who had been divorced and remarried, could hear God has an intention, and even when we fail, his grace is sufficient. And I had somebody quit the church. I was told, how dare you? This person had been divorced. And this person, it was actually a really sad story, and it was not this person's fault, and there was all sorts of, there was infidelity, and there was terrible stuff. And I thought I had not only sort of, without knowing those particular circumstances, like tried to explain and apply in such a way that showed all the manners in which other people's brokenness we still pay consequences for, but again, God's graciousness and everything else. But this person heard me say, I'm not sure if it was either the divorce is a sin part, which is a quotation, or God hates divorce, which is another scriptural quotation, because he wants better for us. Period, the end. Doesn't mean he hates us. It means, when we fall short, and that's your own intention, right? Do people, I'm not being a jerk about this. Do people legitimately get married assuming it's not going to work out, like, no big deal? I mean, don't you go into every marriage assuming it's going to work out? Like, that's your intention. So your intention hasn't come about either. That's kind of what I was getting at. But this person was so offended and so angry. I am never coming back here again. And like, there's just nothing I could say, and I tried. And this person was I'm not going to say active, but this person was around a lot. Not anymore, not after that. This hits to our core in many ways. Concepts of marriage and even sexuality, they hit. It's something very deep and very fundamental within us, which again is why the initial quotation of the chapter hits us so hard. What is a little girl worth? Like, He didn't murder the little girl. The little girl is still alive and is now ostensibly a woman. But we recognize in that violation that something fundamental has occurred. A violation so significant that the concept of your worth is now in the equation somewhere. That's how deeply these things hit us. And the reason for that is that's how we've been built. This is, again, back to scripture, the words of Jesus and the explanations through Paul's epistles. We were built to cleave to one another. Whom God has joined together, let no one put asunder. That this is a holy mystery that gives us some small glimpse of God's love and God's unity with his people, the church. There is something that is so deep inside of us about this, because that's the way God has made us, but not for hurt, not for pain, not for power, but for good, for his glory, for our blessing, for holiness. And we don't use it right, and we fall short, and all these other sort of things, which are a consequence of our fallen humanity, a broken world. But this is the ethic that we have been reminded of, that's been there from the beginning, but to even have it reminded by the life of the church was transformative to the wider world. It was changing a whole society. It was changing people who were living in the exact opposite fashion. This concept of like how Christianity spreads in the underclass first, or slaves and children and women, and that was a critique. Those who were writing against the Christians, that was one of the things. The chapter mentions this. This is only good for the worthless people. But that's because that society had so stratified this whole massive section of people were worthless. Society has decided you're worthless. If you are not this, you're worthless. We can talk about that in the sense of, well, I feel less worthwhile as a human being because, something happened, a governmental policy today, or something happened to me and it wasn't redressed in the way it would have been for somebody else, or whatever. But we're talking like application. We're not talking about fundamental reality. We can say, I feel worthless because this policy made me feel less than you because, but there's not this sense of, well, yes, the universal understanding that we all have is you are worthless. Whoa, like that's kind of something different. The amazing thing is that when we do argue against these things, like, hey, how do we stop rape within our culture, whatever? It's only because of the work of the gospel that's a question that makes any sense. Oh, you're right. We should get rid of rape. We haven't yet. What else can we do to make it better? Like, that's only even a question because the gospel has transformed society to say, oh yeah, this is wrong. Without it, it just happens. If not openly endorsed, which at the time it was. There is a undercurrent that critiques Christian faith in the church as being anti-woman. This is something that's happened within probably the last 2 generations. Some of those were born out of things like no women's ordination, or the way that women were treated within the church, or the ways that women were treated in society that were endorsed by the church, or that had some kind of scriptural reference pointed to, whatever. And I think slowly but surely these things have been are being addressed. And what's really kind of remarkable when you consider it is the primary reason why any of these things have gotten better is because the church, because the gospel. Only because of the work of the gospel can those without power say, this is not right. This is not fair. This is not legal. This is not equitable. This is not. Because until the gospel permeates society, what is left other than might makes right? The strong take what they want and the weak put up with it. And that's at the best. That like we're back to the natural selection kind of stuff. But remember the culture that I just talked about before, where it's not even that good. It's worse than that. It's not just might makes right, but also actively punishing the people who have already been violated. That's nature doesn't do that. It takes humanity to be that bad. But these things are only bad because we have something to compare them to. And that's where the chapter ends, with this very, very beautiful, very succinct summary from C.S. Lewis, where volumes could be written about this. But it's one of the reasons why I like C.S. Lewis so much. There's just a genius in taking a complex argument or thought and explaining it in such clear, simple, understandable terms. And so this is the crooked and the straight that the chapter finishes on. We would have no way to call something unjust unless we believed that there was such a thing as justice. We would not be able to call anything wrong unless there was a right to compare it to. You cannot call a line straight or crooked, and you can't call a line crooked unless you know that there's a straight to compare it to. Any critiques that he had against God is not fair because he lets this thing happen. God is bad, and that is a very, it's sometimes referred to as the problem with pain or the problem with evil. Why would a good God allow these terrible things to happen? The cancer in children, or innocent people washed away by a flood, or young athletes being abused by a coach or a doctor. They were under this person's care and authority. It's horrific and it's wrong and it's not their fault. And any God who would allow that to happen must be bad or doesn't exist. But the problem with that is, how do we define good and bad without a standard? And what is that standard? If it's not a personal opinion, if we're invoking some kind of objective truth, 6-year-old girls should not be violated by their doctors. I say that's an objective truth. Why? Because apparently some cultures seem to think it's okay. Well, if God exists, a creator of all that there is seen and unseen, then in his nature, the very character and nature of God, there is a standard that can be appealed to. We then, this is kind of the atheist dilemma. You want to call God bad or wicked or substandard, compared to what? You're using the terms of his character to try to define him. We don't know what is really bad unless there is a capital G good. There is no, how do you measure a measuring stick? You have to have a stick. This is something that I've talked about before. I think it's in Paris, but it's in France somewhere. There's the International Museum of Weights and Measurements or Standards or whatever. And in their vault or something like that is the meter. I don't mean a meter, I mean the meter. It's made out of something like, I don't know, titanium or molybdenum or whatever. But when they all got together and they decided, this is our standard measurement, you had to have a something in order to say, from now on, you're comparing everything to that. So this thing that they made, or like that's a meter. And everything else, when we say it's a meter, means it corresponds to that. And if it's a little small, it's not a meter. If it's a little big, it's not a meter. Now, they've actually changed it. This was decades ago. But the universal standard measurement is now no longer that piece of metal that they have, because they realized that over the course of millions of years that material would degrade, or there was some kind of extreme, like imperceptible radioactive decay, whatever. So they've established the meter as being a proportion of the constant between, I think it's like a particular frequency of some atomic structure. And so that never changes because it doesn't decay or anything. And so it's like just this measurable distance. But anyway, because you have to have a standard. You can't say something is more or less than a meter if the meter doesn't exist. I had my high school chemistry teacher, his name was Mr. Phillips. And when you got into his class, we had this whole class early on in the year about weights and measurements. And everybody got a ruler, like one of those school wooden rulers, the 1-foot rulers. And on the back, he had written Phillips on it. And we all thought this was to keep us from stealing it because it had his name on it. Because smart teachers write their names on everything because they walk away. Kids take pencils and stuff all the time. So when we got to measuring, he said, what I have given you is 1 metric Phillips. The unit of measurement is a Phillips. See, it says it on the back. It's a Phillips. Well, no, it's a foot. Well, how do you know it's a foot? Well, because it says it's a foot. Okay, look really closely. Put 2 of them together and look at the little tiny markings. They've got the inches and the 1/4 inches and the 1/16 of an inches, or the other side might even have centimeters. Your piece of wood had a little piece of it shaved off at the end. Your ruler, when they were imprinting it, it got off center just a hair. And yours was slightly different. Every single one of them have these very subtle but small changes. I have decreed that it's 1 metric Phillips. And so it is exactly what it says that it is. But that's the only way that this is a reliable unit. If you measure something with this stick, you can measure in terms of a Phillips, but you cannot measure in terms, not reliably, in terms of inches or centimeters or whatever, because you're assuming that that's right, but you don't know that. In our wrestling room, we've got a digital scale that the kids stand on to find out where their weight is, because when you go to wrestle at a tournament, that you're broken into 14 weight classes, and if you're over, you can't wrestle at the weight you think you have to. You have to go and wrestle bigger kids, and everybody wants to wrestle a little bit lighter than they think because you figure, oh, I'm stronger in proportion to kids who weigh less. But well, how do you know that scale is right? The state decrees you have to go get it certified every year. So some expert fiddles with the knobs and puts on different things, and they put a sticker on it to say, yes, when this says 100.01 pounds, it is actually 100.01 pounds and not 0.02. And it's certified. But if all the scales are off, how do you know? And remember, if we're dealing with pounds, we're dealing with weight, not with mass. So whatever you weigh in the wrestling room of Bartow High School, if you climbed a mountain and took your weight there, your weight would be very, very subtly different. And if you were weighed on the moon, your weight would definitely be different. You see what I mean? A standard that we have in order to say this is a crime. This is horrific, the violation, or it's wrong, only comes because we have something reliable and consistent to appeal to. Otherwise, it's all about opinion. To be perfectly honest, and again, why not just get myself in trouble more? This is why the concept of multiculturalism has a fatal flaw. Because all cultures are not equal. This is an old C.S. Lewis quote again. Some cultures say, love your neighbor. Some cultures say, eat your neighbor. How do you say which one is right, which one is wrong, other than opinion or might makes right? You have to appeal to something external, outside and above both cultures. Otherwise, it's just maybe who's ever stronger at the moment. This is the fundamental change that has occurred by the grace of God and through Christ himself. When he appeals to original intent, he is saying this is in the nature of God, who himself is our only definition of good. And his intention for us is good. We misuse it, we spoil it, we break it, we steal it. Horrible, terrible things happen because of it, because of us, to us, through us, against us, whatever. But from the beginning, the intention was good because it comes from God himself. And God is good, capital G God, and capital G good. Anything else? All right, it's Tuffy. Tuffy, thank you. Thank you. These are serious things that I wasn't completely prepared for feeling hard and lousy about this, but I'm glad we were able to do that together. And we will be back again next Wednesday for chapter 5. All right. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Gosh.